The year was 1898. The world was changing rapidly, and a young, ambitious America stood on the brink of transformation. A single explosion in Havana Harbor would set in motion a chain of events that would shatter an empire and create another. The Spanish-American War was short, lasting just 113 days, but its consequences echoed across oceans and centuries. This is the untold story of how the United States, once a young republic, stepped onto the global stage, reshaping its destiny forever and birthing an empire that would dominate the 20th century. Chapter 1: Tensions Across the Atlantic. By the late 19th century, Spain was no longer the powerful empire it once was. Its grip on colonies like Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines was slipping, but Madrid refused to relinquish control. Cuba, in particular, had been fighting for independence for decades, and violent uprisings had become common. The United States, watching closely from just 90 miles away, had growing economic and political interests on the island. American sugar investments were vast, and instability threatened profits and trade. Meanwhile, the American press sensationalized Spanish atrocities against Cuban rebels, fueling anger among the U.S. public. Newspapers led by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer published exaggerated reports of massacres and suffering, shaping public opinion. Spain, attempting to maintain control, imposed brutal tactics under General Valeriano Weyler, nicknamed the Butcher. The world watched as Cuba became a battlefield, and the United States debated its role in what seemed like a growing humanitarian and economic crisis. President William McKinley initially sought diplomacy, trying to balance domestic outrage with international caution. But pressure was mounting. Many Americans saw intervention as both a moral obligation and a strategic opportunity. By early 1898, the U.S. government sent the battleship USS Maine to Havana Harbor, ostensibly to protect American citizens. The stage was set for a spark that would ignite a global conflict. Chapter 2: The Explosion That Changed Everything. On the night of February 15, 1898, a sudden explosion ripped through the USS Maine, killing 266 American sailors. No one knew exactly what caused it, but the press wasted no time blaming Spain. Headlines roared across the country. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." America was furious, and public opinion swung sharply to war. The incident marked a turning point, transforming regional tensions into a national outcry for action. Investigations into the cause were inconclusive, but the damage was already done. Newspapers painted Spain as a barbaric aggressor, and calls for intervention grew louder. McKinley, still cautious, faced intense political pressure from Congress, business leaders, and a population hungry for retribution. The Maine had become more than a ship. It was a symbol of American pride, and its destruction demanded a response. Diplomatic efforts with Spain collapsed. The U.S. issued ultimatums demanding Spanish withdrawal from Cuba. But Madrid refused to surrender its last significant colony in the Americas. By April, the drums of war were beating relentlessly. The United States was about to embark on its first major conflict beyond its borders, and the world was watching. Chapter 3: The Call to Arms. On April 25, 1898, Congress declared war on Spain, marking the official start of the Spanish-American War. Across the nation, young men enlisted in droves, inspired by patriotism, outrage, and the promise of adventure. America, still recovering from the wounds of the Civil War, found itself united under a common cause for the first time in decades. Mobilizing for war wasn't easy. The U.S. military was small, poorly equipped, and inexperienced in overseas campaigns. Yet enthusiasm was high, and leaders like Theodore Roosevelt, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, saw the conflict as an opportunity to elevate America's status. Roosevelt resigned his post to form the Rough Riders, a volunteer cavalry regiment that would soon become legendary. Spain, meanwhile, underestimated the United States' resolve. Confident in its naval traditions, Madrid expected to hold its colonies without difficulty. But the balance of power was shifting. The U.S. Navy, modernized and equipped with steel warships, was far more advanced than Spain's aging fleet. As the first ships set sail, America prepared to assert itself on the world stage. Chapter 4: The Battle of Manila Bay. The first major clash came in the Philippines on May 1, 1898. Commodore George Dewey led the U.S. Asiatic Squadron into Manila Bay under cover of darkness. At dawn, his fleet unleashed a devastating barrage against the Spanish Pacific Fleet. Within hours, the Spanish ships were in ruins, and Dewey secured a stunning victory without losing a single American life. This unexpected triumph marked the beginning of America's expansion into Asia. The Philippines, once a distant Spanish colony, became a strategic prize for the United States. Suddenly, the war was no longer just about Cuba. It was about global influence. However, victory brought complications. Filipino revolutionaries, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, saw the U.S. as an ally in their fight for independence. But Dewey's orders came from Washington, where expansionist ambitions were growing. Tensions between American promises of liberation and plans for annexation would soon erupt into conflict. Chapter 5: Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. While Dewey's victory made headlines, the real spotlight turned to Cuba, where the most famous battle of the war unfolded. In June 1898, U.S. forces landed near Santiago, facing rough terrain, tropical diseases, and fierce resistance. Among them was Theodore Roosevelt's volunteer cavalry, the Rough Riders, composed of cowboys, athletes, and adventurers from across the nation. On July 1, 1898, Roosevelt led his men in the Battle of San Juan Hill, charging up steep slopes under heavy fire. The victory, combined with African-American regiments' critical support, became an enduring symbol of American valor. Roosevelt's leadership catapulted him to national fame, setting the stage for his eventual presidency. Spain's forces, however, fought bravely despite dwindling supplies and outdated weaponry. But as U.S. troops pressed forward and disease ravaged Spanish ranks, Santiago's defenses began to crumble. The war in Cuba was nearing its decisive moment. Chapter 6: The Fall of Santiago. By mid-July, Santiago de Cuba, Spain's last major stronghold on the island, was under siege. American forces, supported by Cuban rebels, surrounded the city, cutting off supply lines and bombarding defenses. Inside Santiago, Spanish troops faced starvation, disease, and collapsing morale. On July 3, 1898, the Spanish Caribbean fleet attempted a desperate escape. Admiral Pascual Cervera led his ships out of Santiago Harbor, hoping to break through the American blockade. Instead, the U.S. Navy annihilated the Spanish fleet in just a few hours. Without naval support, Santiago's fall was inevitable. On July 17, 1898, Spain surrendered Santiago to U.S. forces. It was a decisive victory that effectively ended Spain's control in the Caribbean. For America, it was proof that the young nation had emerged as a formidable military power. For Spain, it marked the beginning of the end of its centuries-old empire. Chapter 7. The War in Puerto Rico. Even as Santiago fell, U.S. forces turned their attention to Puerto Rico, another key Spanish colony. In late July, American troops landed unopposed at Guanica, greeted in some areas as liberators. Puerto Rican rebels, inspired by Cuba's struggle, welcomed U.S. forces in hopes of independence. The campaign was swift and largely bloodless, as Spain's exhausted forces offered little resistance. Within weeks, American troops controlled most of the island, and by August, Puerto Rico was firmly under U.S. occupation. This rapid conquest highlighted America's growing power and hinted at its broader ambitions. Puerto Rico, like Guam and the Philippines, would become a permanent U.S. possession, solidifying America's presence across both the Caribbean and the Pacific. Chapter 8. The Treaty of Paris. With its forces defeated across the globe, Spain sought peace. Negotiations culminated in the Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898. Under its terms, Spain relinquished control of Cuba, ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States, and effectively ended its centuries-long imperial dominance. For the U.S., this was a turning point. The war had lasted just 4 months, but reshaped the nation's destiny. America now possessed overseas territories spanning 2 oceans, transforming it into a global power. Yet the treaty sparked intense domestic debate. Critics argued that America was betraying its founding principles by replacing Spanish colonialism with its own. Expansionists, however, celebrated the dawn of an American empire. Chapter 9. The Philippine Dilemma. While Cuba gained independence, the Philippines faced a different fate. The U.S. decided to annex the islands, believing they were vital to America's strategic position in Asia. But Filipino revolutionaries, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, rejected American control, sparking the brutal Philippine-American War. This bloody conflict, often overshadowed by the Spanish-American War, lasted from 1899 to 1902 and claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. It forced America to confront the realities of imperialism, as U.S. soldiers found themselves fighting against the very people they once promised to liberate. The Philippine War exposed deep divisions within the United States about its role in the world. Was America a liberator, or had it become the very thing it once opposed, an empire built on conquest? Chapter 10. Anti-imperialism at home. Back in the United States, a fierce political debate erupted. The Anti-Imperialist League, which included figures like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and former President Grover Cleveland, condemned the annexation of territories as a betrayal of American values. They warned that ruling distant peoples without their consent violated the principles of freedom and self-determination. Expansionists countered, arguing that America had a duty to civilize and modernize its new territories, embracing a sense of manifest destiny on a global scale. This ideological clash defined U.S. foreign policy for decades and marked the beginning of America's complicated relationship with power, morality, and empire. Chapter 11. The rise of Theodore Roosevelt. The Spanish-American War catapulted Theodore Roosevelt into the national spotlight. His exploits at San Juan Hill made him a war hero and symbolized America's newfound assertiveness. In 1901, Roosevelt became the youngest U.S. president after the assassination of William McKinley. Roosevelt embraced America's role as a global power, expanding the Navy and pursuing aggressive foreign policies. His big stick diplomacy and the construction of the Panama Canal cemented America's influence across the Western Hemisphere and beyond. Under Roosevelt, the United States shifted from isolationism to interventionism, setting the stage for its role as a dominant force in the 20th century. Chapter 12: Cuba's Independence and U.S. Influence. While Cuba technically gained independence after the war, the reality was more complex. The U.S. maintained significant control through the Platt Amendment, which allowed Washington to intervene in Cuban affairs and establish a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Cuban leaders resented this arrangement, viewing it as a new form of colonialism. Nevertheless, American economic and political influence shaped Cuba's trajectory for decades, setting the stage for future tensions between the two nations. The Spanish-American War had freed Cuba from Spain, but true sovereignty remained elusive under America's watchful eye. Chapter 13: Spain's Decline. For Spain, the war marked a tragic turning point. Once the world's greatest empire, Spain emerged from 1898 humiliated and diminished. Losing Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines left it with only a few small colonies in Africa. The defeat triggered political instability, economic hardship, and national soul-searching. Spanish intellectuals called it the disaster of '98, a moment of reckoning for a nation struggling to redefine its identity in the modern world. Ironically, Spain's decline created opportunities for the U.S., which filled the power vacuum left behind, stepping into roles Spain had once dominated. Chapter 14: America's New Role on the World Stage. The Spanish-American War marked the United States' transformation from a regional power into a global player. With territories spanning the Pacific and the Caribbean, America now had military, economic, and strategic reach like never before. This newfound influence emboldened U.S. leaders to intervene in international conflicts and shape global politics. From the Philippines to Puerto Rico, America's presence was felt far beyond its borders. The war also marked the beginning of debates that still shape U.S. foreign policy today. Questions about empire, morality, and the responsibilities of power. Chapter 15: The Legacy of 1898. The events of 1898 left a lasting legacy. The Spanish-American War reshaped borders, toppled empires, and marked the birth of the American century. It also revealed contradictions at the heart of America's identity, a nation founded on liberty, now ruling over millions without their consent. From Cuba to the Philippines, the consequences of this short war reverberated for generations. It influenced America's role in both world wars, the Cold War, and even modern geopolitics. More than a century later, the war remains a pivotal chapter in understanding how the United States became a global superpower. The explosion of the USS Maine, the battles of Manila and Santiago, and the debates over imperialism all shaped the path of history in ways few could have imagined. History remembers 1898 as the moment the United States stepped into the world arena. What began as a call to liberate Cuba ended with an empire stretching across oceans. It was a war of ideals, ambition, and unintended consequences, and its echoes still influence us today. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most transformative wars, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss more untold stories from the past. The birth of an empire was just the beginning, and there's so much more history to uncover.